Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, joined by William Albrecht and Elijah Yasi. And today we're going to be discussing the Prepurified Virgin, how the Blessed Virgin Mary overcame original sin, and of course, dealing with Immaculate Conception. And just for a little bit of background, this is prompted by different arguments that are offered by various Eastern Orthodox. So William and Elijah are going to be offering some responses to objections to the Immaculate Conception. William, Elijah, how are y'all gentlemen doing?
Doing well. Thank you, Michael. How are you?
Very, very good.
Doing very well. Glad to be here.
William, go ahead and take it from here. I know that you had a couple arguments that you were going to be addressing, so I'll just let you, take the reins.
Yeah, no doubt. And I'm really, really excited to be able to talk about this. For people that may not know, we're going to go in depth as well next week when we have Father Kappas on. When he's going to talk about, originally he was going to talk about essence and energies first. He's going to talk about the Immaculate Conception, and we're going to have him on again as well to talk about essence and energies. But there are a few arguments that have been floating out there that to me seemed needed to be addressed. So I said, you know what, I dialogue with my good friend Elijah quite often, and I said, you know what, I really think that there's certain things that have been put out there that we do need to touch upon. There are arguments that I would not necessarily dub them Eastern Orthodox arguments, because I have quite a few friends that are Eastern Orthodox that embrace the teaching of the Immaculate Conception. I know most people that are probably following along the show know what the teaching is, but to briefly sum it up, as defined in Ineffabilis Dei, we are told that from the very first instant of her conception, of her existence, basically, Mary was preserved free from original sin. So really, what is Catholicism saying in this regard? Really, Catholicism is saying that by the grace of God, by the graces of Christ, Mary was preserved from original sin. So I like to say Mary defeated original sin, and I point to the imagery we get in Genesis 3. But really, ultimately, the one that defeated all remnants, all sin is Christ. And we say Mary defeated original sin because of the graces bestowed upon her from Christ. And I do want that to be clear. I don't want people to think that we believe by her own merits, Mary was able to avoid original sin or defeat original sin. We aren't saying that. But there is a book that my good friend, very good friend, Father Kappas put out. My book is in terrible shape. I've read it probably a ton of times. Michael, you probably have your copy already soon. Father Kappas is coming out with another edition. It's a great book. Mm-hmm. So in this book, by the way, Father Kappas, if he's not watching now, he will probably watch the replay. No doubt he's looking forward to following along. He came out with some incredible material, but I've got to be honest. Father Kappas has even told me, you know what, William, this isn't my stuff. I'm looking in the medieval school era, looking at the medieval schoolmen, what they talked about, looking at what Manuel Candal wrote in Spanish, and I'm bringing this into English for the public, and of course adding, furthering, looking into the Greek and other developments that Father Kappas has found in perhaps documents we hadn't seen before, and he's bringing forward the usage of the Greek word prokathartisa, which means a completely sinless nature with more graces added at a later time in history when referring to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And I was being pointed towards a few videos, a few articles, and what have you that touch upon arguments that I've used in debate, arguments that Father Kappas presents. And people may be wondering, well, why have you used these arguments? Well, I'm very good friends with Father Kappas. We're close friends. And I dialogue with him each time I have any Marian debate. And I tell him, Father, teach me, teach me. You are the expert, and he is incredible. And we've dialogued. In fact, I've sat down with him, talked to him, and we've gone over every single usage of Prepurified. And there are a ton of them. We've gone over every single one. I've got every single one in PDF format and got it open in front of me. So one thing that I heard that was another thing that I see brought up, an argument in a video that I was watching a few days ago, was the claim that Father Kappas, and I quoted all these things. I made quotes and I wrote them down. Doesn't believe that the Immaculate Conception is a historical teaching of the church. That he claims that it is rather, instead of being historical, that it is doctrinal development. Well, I know you know a whole lot about that particular area, Michael. So I do want to ask you your opinion on something. Can something be a historical teaching of the church and still develop doctrinally? Is that possible?
Yeah, I think so. The thing is that we would have to say that teaching has to be there implicit in what was delivered by the apostles. So it cannot just develop out of something that was made up in the 3rd or 4th century. It has to go back to, at the very least, something implicit from the apostles that has either a logical or a historical necessity to it, if we're going to be talking about something that is dogmatic.
No doubt. And you made an incredible point there, because Father Kappas does definitely believe that this is apostolic. In fact, he, as we will discover later, hopefully next week when we talk about it, he does believe that we can find it implicitly within the pages of Holy Writ. But hopping on over to one thing that I hear brought up quite often is Gregory's oration, Gregory of Nazianzus, because Gregory is really the first person that Father Kappas deals with when talking about prokathartisa. And the important oration to look at is oration 38, because as we will go, as the show goes on, as we look at John of Damascus, Nicholas Cabasilas, and other individuals, they did snag onto the teaching of that Gregory did use in regards to Mary's purification. And everywhere we look, every doctor of the church, every father that comments that uses this word, they use it pretty much in the exact same manner. There really is no exception. To make the case clear again, Father Kappas has looked at every single usage of the word. I've looked at every single usage with him. It seems to me very, very clear. What Gregory is saying here is said by other individuals. Later on, we'll look at what John of Damascus says and a few other individuals. But I'm basically going in line for the arguments that I've encountered in articles and videos that individuals of the Eastern persuasion have put forward, perhaps without realizing that within Eastern Orthodoxy there are several scholars that hold to whether or not, regardless of them holding to this, to not holding to this in a dogmatic fashion, they believe that the Immaculate Conception is definitely something that the faithful has always believed. There is one argument that I noticed pulled up, and I'm going to go ahead and more or less sum up what we are told about Nicholas of Cabasilas. And there is something very important that he writes, and you can find it in the Patrologia Orientalis 19. We have an excellent, by the way, translation. I'm not certain if Father Kappas includes it in the book. I think he does, but you can find it on his Academia if he doesn't include it there. But the quote is a really good one, and it seems to be misunderstood by certain individuals that are saying, I'm going to quote it, it is a loose reference. Prokathartisa is not being used the way Roman Catholicism thinks it's being used. And then it is a major error from Father Kappas. And another particular one that I find interesting, William doesn't have a firm handle on Father Kappas' argument. But that's a whole other topic. I think I have a very firm handle. But let us look at Nicholas Cabasilas, because we really, when I was coming across his arguments, I've heard it more than once, by the way. There's nothing in Nicholas Cabasilas, I've been told. But really, I've never seen the quote examined, Michael or Elijah. I think Elijah knows exactly what I'm talking about. Nicholas Cabasilas actually deals with the Greek word prokathartisa, and it's rather mind-blowing what he says, because he's hearkening to the past usages of the Greek word, and he says, of the holy doctors who say that the Virgin is prepurified, the Greek prokathartisa, by the Spirit, then it is yet necessary to think that purification, and there he is using the Greek katharsin, from the Greek word katharizo from the Bible. Why is he making the connection here? Because most of the time in the Greek Bible, in the Septuagint and in the New Testament, the majority of the time katharizzo is used in carrying with it a negative connotation. So Nicholas Kabbasalis is saying here, we've got the Greek word prokathartisa here, but when this is used for Mary, we need to think of this purification not in terms of for sin. He says it is an addition of graces. And then he says, this is what is intended by those authors. And these doctors say that this is the way the angels are purified, with respect to whom there is nothing knavish. So the one major quote that I thought was really important that we had to bring out was Nicholas Kabbasalis, because he shows us how that Greek word prokathartisa is used. What was, to me, this is really similar to the way Fulgentius of Rusby, Hilary of Poitiers, and others use the term flesh of sin. You have later fathers that latch upon that and say, okay, when the doctors and the fathers use that term, this is what they mean. And in very similar fashion, Nicholas Kabbasalis is doing that. We have others that will do that, such as Sophronius and a few others that we'll look at later. But I think that is very important. When bringing out Nicholas Kabbasalis, who, by the way, should be an important figure within the Eastern faith, I would imagine he should be an important figure. We should all consider him an important figure. This is a very incredible testimony here. And when we look at others, we're going to see that a whole lot more incredible stuff is brought up. I do want to kind of toss the ball over to Elijah a little bit because I've dialogued with him so much. Elijah's got so much that I know he can share. And we've been talking about this leading up to this this dialogue that we wanted to do, more of a friendly dialogue. We're not here in a hostile manner, here to say, well, look, Eastern Orthodoxy, you guys are degenerates, so you guys are, there's something messed up with you. Not at all. I've got a lot of really good friends that are of the Eastern persuasion. I am very good friends with some scholars from Eastern Orthodoxy. Really, what we're here to do is answer the concerns and the claims that have been levied against this doctrine, and to say, look, it is possible to look into the East in particular and see that this teaching was definitely a teaching that was held to at a very early period.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, William. What I recommend is, so I'm here to sort of destroy the straw man. There's been arguments against the Immaculate Conception, and when I listen to these arguments, they're not really arguing against the actual dogma of the Immaculate Conception, but more so a misrepresentation of it. There is an article that I recommend. It's fairly short. You can read it in about 15 minutes. It's called The Immaculate Conception and the Preternatural Gifts, and I have it printed right here. It's by Dr. Albert Kips, not to be confused with Kippes. It's spelled almost the same. It's Kippes. You can find it on Google. If you want to contact me, I can send it to you. This really destroys all the misrepresentations that are out there about the Immaculate Conception from Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, and even from Catholics themselves as well. And it really goes into detail about the preternatural gifts. And what are those? What do we believe those are? Is before the fall, Adam and Eve enjoyed what we call the preternatural gifts, which are immortality. So, the ability to not die, and the basically integrity as far as impassibility, ability not to suffer, right? So they always had joy. They never suffered. They had no concupiscence, so that they weren't really drawn into sin and temptation in the same way that we are today. And these are gifts that were endowed on them by God. Now, a lot of people like to think that these gifts come from nature. They don't. So these gifts are by grace. So God has endowed grace on Adam and Eve before the fall that gave them these privileges, right? And if we're going to talk about these privileges, if we're going to talk about original sin and Immaculate Conception, we have to understand what the Catholic Church teaches, right? We can't understand it in light of what Protestantism teaches, or in light of Eastern Orthodoxy or Oriental Orthodoxy teaches. We have to understand it from the proper context of the Catholic Church. And with that said, we do not believe that Mary enjoyed the preternatural gifts because of her Immaculate Conception. Now, those are connected. In order to have preternatural gifts, you have to not have original sin or not be conceived in original sin. Okay, but the privileges that she received are directly connected to her divine maternity, her role as Mother of God. And with that said, we have to look at each gift, and we have to look at, is this gift necessary for her to carry out her role? So, for example, one can say in the Eastern Orthodox or maybe Oriental Orthodoxy that if Mary died, that means she had original sin. In Catholicism, it doesn't work that way, because you could be born without, or you can be conceived without original sin and still die, because those are two different things, where not being conceived in original sin is a grace that you receive. But in addition to that, there is grace that you receive in order not to die, right? So when we look at Mary, did Mary die? The church doesn't really answer that question, but most theologians would agree that she did die. But that doesn't mean that she had original sin. That just means that she did not enjoy that preternatural privilege or gift that God endowed Adam and Eve. Now, did Mary suffer? So we discovered here that Mary did not have that gift of immortality. Right? She did not have that. But did Mary suffer? The answer is yes. So she didn't receive that gift of impassibility, where there is the where you're not able to suffer at all, and that's what Adam and Eve enjoyed before the fall. So those are two gifts or privileges that she did not enjoy, because they were not connected to her divine maternity role to carry out that role. Every gift that she had is connected to her to carry out the role. Now, in order to carry out the role, she needed to have no sin. She needed to have no blemish, no stain. And the fathers of the church talk about her having no stain and no blemish. In Catholicism, if we say that Mary was conceived in original sin, if we say that, what we are really saying is that she was conceived under the dominion or the power of the devil, which goes contradictory to Genesis 3:15, where God says, I will put enmity between you and the woman. And that enmity here, there has to be that enmity from the moment of her existence. And that's where the original sin dogma is flowing from, is that enmity where the devil is not touching her, is not contacting or contracting her, in order for her to have been born or conceived in original sin. God endowed her with grace, right? And there's a quote that I believe William is going to share from St. John Damascene, where he's talking about how Mary received grace, and that grace was in contrast with nature. And he's contrasting nature, and he's talking about nature and grace. And I'll let William read that when he gets to it, but it's directly connected to what we believe is the Immaculate Conception, where Mary was endowed with much grace, so much grace in order to be able to be a virgin, and at the same time have the Son of God in her womb. And then after the birth of the Son of God, she still remained a virgin. That all requires grace. This is not done by nature, right? Now, Christ, we believe, was conceived without original sin. But there are differences between Christ being conceived without original sin and Mary. Christ was conceived without original sin because he was born of a woman without a father, so there was no concupiscence there. So he had it by right. It was his right because of the way he was born, the way he was conceived. with Mary, it wasn't by right. She should have contracted original sin. She should have not received any privileges, just like everyone else. It was the grace, and obviously in Luke it says Mary was full of grace. It was the grace that prevented her from contracting original sin when she was conceived. And Saint John Damascene also talks about how her parents were conceiving without concupiscence. So, and I know Williams is going to talk about that in connection with Saint Augustine and what he believed original sin is and all that stuff. So I'll pass it on to Williams again. I do have other things that I wanted to share from the article. Everything that I'm saying here, it comes from here. So if what I'm saying isn't clear, please go online, read this. It is bar none the best article I've read on the Immaculate Conception in connection to preternatural gifts.
Yeah, that is excellent, Elijah. Very, very good. And we do need to be clear that whenever presenting an argument, if you can poke a bunch of holes through that argument, you need to really re-examine that. And you don't hear very often the argument presented that Mary died, that means Mary must have had original sin. It's just not a good argument, because if you look at the way the Greek is used in the Septuagint, when you read of Enoch and Elijah being translated to heaven, you directly read before that where we are told that they are the actual descendants of Adam. They would have been under that the federal headship of sin, if you will. They would have been. Yet we know that there are exceptions. Not everybody that would have been part of the fall would have been required to die. So we know that there are exceptions. We know, regardless of the fact that Christ willingly gave his life, Christ still died. So we know that is a poor argument. It's not a very good argument. You don't find it being used by the fathers. You don't have John of Damascus, Paschasius, Radbertus, Ambrose of Milan, to mention a few that talk about the very nature of Mary. You don't have them say Mary died because Mary had contracted original sin. You just don't find that argument. It's not a very good argument at all, which really we need to deal with arguments that make sense, that aren't refuted within the Bible themselves. You mentioned John of Damascus. That is excellent, because, yeah, when we look at his nativity oration, the language is really clear there when he says, "O all blessed loins of Joachim, from which the all pure sperm was sown." And then he says, "O epic womb, in which the all holy infant was born, after she was formed, and a little later increased by nutriments from Anne. Her belly conceived in itself an ensouled heaven wider than the wide space of heaven." The incredible thing of John of Damascus is that John of Damascus is using Byzantine medical terminology that was present, that can be read, that can be looked at from his time period. And he does that to talk about the very fact that Mary had a completely sinless nature. As we know, he makes it very clear that Mary was born without original sin, because in other places, John of Damascus does talk about original sin. He's very clear in the language that he's using. But it's very, very clear here when he says that the Theotokos, the virgin, was about to be born from Anne, and nature didn't dare to anticipate Grace's offspring, but remained fruitless until Grace produced fruit. It was needed that the firstborn bore the one born first of all creation, in whom all things were made. O blessed coupling of Joachim and Anne, all nature is duty bound to you, for through you a gift added a more weighty gift to creation than all gifts, the august mother, the only one worthy of him who dwelt there. Then we get into the language of the all blessed loins of Joachim. So really, the one thing that I have noticed, Elijah and Michael, is we can quote fathers until the cows come home that show that Mary had a completely sinless nature by the graces of God. I argue you can find it at a very early period. But at times we do have individuals of various different persuasions of faith, perhaps Eastern or even Protestant, that will say, "I don't care, give me a father that tells me about the actual conception being immaculate." Fair game. You have it in John of Damascus. But you've got it even before John of Damascus in Romanus the Melodist, which, by the way, I'm presenting that right now. I've been dialoguing with Father Kappas about that. Very likely we will go into that even more in depth next week. We're going to examine the Greek of that. We're going to examine it. We're going to go into in depth on that. But Romanus the Melodist is already talking in this time period of the celebration of the Immaculate Conception of Mary. I mean, you can't get any clearer than that. So if you want to talk about actual fathers talking about immaculate conceptions in terms of lacking original sin, you have Romanos the Melodist, you have John of Damascus, and later on you have an individual that was really more known for, his dialogues on the Eucharist than anything else was Paschasius Redbertus. So you have a few there that talk about the actual conception being one that would have been immaculate in the way that we're talking about it. There's a lot to be read, but going a little further down there, another argument that I've encountered quite often is when we touch upon Mark of Ephesus and Joseph Brienios. Joseph Brienios, by the way, is a very important figure. We are told, and I'm going to read what we're told and sum it up. We're told that inferences have gone wild, that there is nothing in Joseph Brienios that we can actually look at that would give us an indication that perhaps Joseph Brienios believed that Mary would have been created with a completely sinless nature. So if we look at actually looking at the text and actually examining the text, Joseph Brienios is very clear. Remember that Joseph Brienios could either be labeled as Mark's teacher or Mark's companion, either which way he influenced Mark of Ephesus. What Joseph Brienios says is very, very significant. And even more so when you examine the Greek of what he says. So I've sent the Greek to Michael and to Elijah, but the English reads, another woman was not chosen over her because God, foreknowing all women, sanctified in his mother's womb the one who was to be worthiest of all who were to exist, establishing her beyond all virtues, but he rejected all the women unworthy of this purpose as was reasonable. She possessed a virtue superior to all other virtues, that of being prepurified, the Greek prokatharthisa, by the Holy Spirit, as being prepared as a contained receptacle of the inaccessible divinity. If you analyze with Joseph Brienios, because certain individuals will tell us there's nothing there in Joseph Brienios, but then we don't get the language examined at all. We need to look at primary source material, not just gloss over it and say, well, there's nothing there. Joseph Brienios is giving us an imagery of the divine mind, saying that God chose Mary before she was even formed in her mother's womb. She was sanctified, but the sanctification is not a cleansing from sin. How do we know this? We know it because the kind of sanctification is one where it is a bestowal of incredible divine graces. Look at the Greek used by Joseph here. When I looked at this text, when I dialogued with my friend Father Kappas, I was kind of perplexed by the Greek. In fact, I'm still perplexed by some of these Greek terms used by individuals like Joseph Brienios, Mark of Ephesus. They're incredible Greek words. The one used here by Joseph Brienios, really, when you look it up, you can do a few searches. Really, the only other area where you can find this used prior to Brienios is in Greek goddess mythology of Axiothera. Now, I know Joseph Brienios is not saying that Mary is a goddess. I'm not arguing that at all. But what Joseph Brienios is doing, he's using incredibly powerful language to the point to hammer home one point. His point is, Mary possessed a virtue superior to all others. And that virtue was that Mary would be more worthy than any. And this was done in the divine mind. Do I think that this teaching would have influenced Mark of Ephesus? I do. Mark of Ephesus' language is very powerful when he says that the toddler Mary, even as a toddler, Mary was already completely in essence, he gives us an image of her being incredibly perfect, uses very powerful Greek terminology for Mary. The language used by the East is language that I have to say is mind-blowingly beautiful. Rather than anybody rejecting the East as enemies, we should embrace what the East has given us, because it is my firm argument that the clear teaching of Mary being called immaculate comes from the East. Rufinus took the translation from the great Gregory Nazianzus, took that pre-pro-Cathartisa, translated that as immaculate. That tells you a lot. He understood that as, at the time period, immaculate was clearly stained from original sin, stain that came from original sin. Rufinus was able to understand. Gregory of Nazianzus was saying exactly that Mary was free from original sin. And I think that's something that we really, really need to look at clearer, to look at more. I mean, there's so much more to look at. I know Elijah was talking about, I think he had a few scholars that he was able to dig up. And I mean, I'd like to maybe look at that for a little bit, Elijah. Do you perhaps have that on hand?
As far as the preternatural gifts, or?
Right, correct, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is the article that I was referencing, and he references plenty of scholars from even Aquinas, believe it or not. He references, and this is something written from 1950. And so, you know, like I said, I just point everyone to this article. It's going to do a lot better job than me in explaining it, but I don't mind going into it. I have highlighted a lot of things, but as I'm highlighting, I'm like, man, this is like me reading basically the whole article on here, because everything that he says is so good. But he does ask a question here, actually a few questions. If you don't mind, Michael and William, if I can read this here.
Oh, yeah.
He says, but Mary too came from the hands of God without stain or blemish. The grace which God lavished upon her soul procured certain effects, just as it did for our first parents and as it does for us. However, did divine providence desire to restore the Holy Virgin simply to the state of primitive innocence in virtue of her Immaculate Conception? Did it decree that all the effects possible for grace, even those of which the human race had been deprived on account of the sin of Adam, should adorn her privileged soul? Exemption from the stain and pain of sin, does this simply imply the necessary absence of all its consequences? Does the Immaculate Conception confer on Mary a title, a right to be exempt from even the natural defects of our human nature? Or does she primarily belong to the state of fallen and redeemed nature, and so through the merciful designs of providence was preserved from the stain of original sin? And then he says there are some theologians who, basing themselves on the adage that to Mary must be conceded whatever was conferred by God on purely human creature, hold that Mary's Immaculate Conception placed her at least in the same condition of our first parents, the state of primitive innocence. And this is the key. He says, however, the majority of theologians have with reason doubted this or simply rejected it. So, in other words, he's asking the question, was Mary in the exact state that Adam and Eve was or were before the fall? And he's saying that the majority of theologians would answer, no, she was not. Now, we would say that she was even more holy than Adam and Eve were before the fall. You know, she received graces that flowed from the cross of Christ, right? And that's how she was redeemed, is from those graces that flowed from the cross. But more so, redeeming her, she was also preserved from contracting original sin from any moment of her existence. And William, you talked about the flesh of sin, right? And in a sense, one could say that Mary did, in a sense, like I said, in a sense that she did have a flesh of sin because she was the daughter of Adam. So she came from Adam, right? And so for on one sense or one side, we can say that she had the flesh of sin, but on the other side, her state was so unique She had a unique state to where she was sort of a combination of the pre-lapsarian Adam and Eve and the post-lapsarian Adam and Eve, in the sense that she did not contract original sin, and she did not have concupiscence, and she had infused knowledge, and those are gifts that Adam and Eve enjoyed before the fall. But in another sense, she suffered and she died, right? And for that reason, she sort of has both the pre-lapsarian and post-lapsarian kind of in her, right? And the church, excuse me here, the church doesn't use a language of pre-lapsarian flesh and post-lapsarian flesh. Sorry about that. I just gotta get this.
Yeah, not a problem. You can hear it clearly. You're good.
Okay, perfect. I'm gonna turn off my camera here because it keeps. There we go. So
no problem.
The church doesn't use this language of pre-lapsarian and post-lapsarian flesh and whatnot, but we do use a language of pre-lapsarian and post-lapsarian privileges and gifts, right? And we can talk about that with Mary. So again, just because she died doesn't mean she had original sin, right?
Right.
Now, one could say that Christ suffered, right? But he chose to suffer. It was something that he took on. It wasn't something that was kind of by right that he would suffer. It's something that he took on. He assumed his suffering. He assumed death. It wasn't something that was natural to him. With Mary, she died. If you were to believe that as a Catholic, and you're more than welcome to disagree with that, and that's okay. And she suffered because that was in her nature, right? Because she wasn't born in the same state that Adam and Eve were in before the fall in every single way, only in the way that those privileges and gifts are going to help her carry out her mission. Now let's talk about suffering for a little bit here. She suffered, and her suffering actually was something that helped her carry out her gift. That's very interesting because, with Adam and Eve, before suffering was entered into the world, suffering would have been a negative or a bad thing. But in the fallen world, where we talk about redemptive suffering, where we talk about suffering and offering it up and making you stronger and holier, her suffering contributed to her divine maternity role, right? So it added to it. And so God saw fit that she should have she should suffer and not have that gift of impassibility. I'd like to find where Dr. Albert Kipps talks about the flesh of sin. So, I'll come back to that, William, but if you want to harken back and continue on with what you were saying before, if you'd like.
Sure, that is incredible, Elijah. That is one thing that when I've debated the Immaculate Conception quite a bit, and I've given a number of talks, and I pointed out that when you look at the way the fathers use flesh of sin, you need to look at it in context, because you've got guys like Fulgentius of Rusby that will say Mary had flesh of sin, and then later on, or even beforehand, he is very clear that he believes Mary was immaculate in soul and in nature by the grace of God. So really, we have to be careful with the kind of language being used. We need to go back and look at first-hand source material, not merely quoting people whose blogs and articles you might find online. There's a ton of scholars out there for a reason. Father Koppes has done magnificent work on this. And I'm reminded of another argument put forth. I keep hearing it ringing in my head, where we're told that inferences have gone wild in terms of Mark of Ephesus as well. Well, we talked about Joseph Brianios for a bit, and you can clearly tell similarity in language. And you look at Mark of Ephesus, in his contrast of deified saints to the Virgin Mary, he says, and this is pretty powerful language, it's mind-blowingly incredible Eastern language. Nevertheless, let one remove every rational account with respect to that which concerns the Theotokos, who alone is the most supernatural marvel among supernaturals realized from eternity. There we've got the divine mind again, who is also higher than all rational discourse. For in a true way, God wished his own omnipotence to be manifested in this woman. I've read what Mark of Ephesus has written. I've dialogued with Father about Mark of Ephesus. I don't think any of these are inferences. I think the language is very powerful, kind of like the language you find in John of Damascus. When this language is being used, we need to go back to the original. We need to see the way these terms are being used, not simply put up the English without any actual context. I have a little thing that I like to do, and that is actual research. If a certain word is used in a certain manner, I like to look at how that word is used. And for Mark of Ephesus and Joseph Brienios, and in a little bit we'll look at Gregory Palamas. By the way, we also talked about Nicholas Cabasilas. Cabasilas, how you say it. If we look at these individuals, we have to realize these are what Eastern people will call titans of the faith. You know, they're no slouches, Elijah. You know that quite well. And the way they use the language they use for Mary is so powerful. You know, I was talking to Father Coppins. I remember talking to him a few months ago, and I said, "Wow, this, you know, using this kind of language nowadays, you know, some people would accuse you of blasphemy, but they are not being blasphemous. They're just emphasizing the incredible graces that our Lord and Savior has bestowed upon Mary." And I think that is something that we need to really, really look at, really embrace. And one thing that I did notice also, and I'm going down the line of arguments I've encountered, videos, a video that I was pointed to, where we also hear claims of Ephraim. I met my friend Elijah. When I first met Elijah a few months ago, I think one of the very first conversations we had was on Ephraim. I remember those conversations. I'm very fond of them. And we've done deep research into Ephraim. I have dialogued with Syriac patristic experts on Ephraim that don't think that Ephraim believed that Mary had original sin. I think it is very clear that Mary didn't have original sin in Ephraim. We all look at the Nisabene hymn 27, where we read, "There's no blemish in you, Lord, nor are there any stains in your mother." You frequently have that little passage brought up, but then you have certain people that say, "You Catholics, you guys are just ripping that out of context. You guys are just, you're being pop apologists. You guys are, read the whole context." I've read the whole context. Then they'll say, "Well, Ephraim, he also talks about Mary being baptized." So I was able to read those passages of Ephraim where he talks about Mary being baptized. And then I've been told by certain people that every time the fathers talk about baptism is for sin. That would be quite the conundrum, because the fathers talk about Christ's baptism very often, and I don't think they thought Christ was baptized for sin. But besides the point, we have to look at the way authors used language. The very same Ephraim, who was the author of Nisabene hymn 27, was also the author of 43 and many others that I was able to dig up, and Elijah knows exactly what I'm talking about, where Ephraim uses the exact same terminology: blemish, stain, blemish. He goes on to talk about the fact that he believes stains were original sin and sins. Well, in his hymns, more than one time, he says, even after baptism, we have vestiges of sin upon ourselves. We have stains. He says, "Lord, will you whiten my stains at your banquet with your radiance?" He uses that kind of language over and over. He doesn't use it only once. He used it, I cataloged, about 5 times. Now, this is where logic has to come into play. Because if Ephraim is equating stains and blemish with original sin or with sin, and he's then saying that only in you, Lord, and your mother are these blemishes and stains lacking, I think connecting the dots is rather simple once you get to that point. And Ephraim believed Mary to have been free from original sin, free from every kind of sin. There is so much more to be read in Ephraim, his robe of glory. I know Elijah knows what I'm talking about, and a whole lot more. But I'm dealing with the very fact that I have dialogue with patristic Syriac experts. I was hoping to have Brock on the show. I remember Michael and Elijah, remember that. Brock fell ill. I've reached out to him again. Hopefully he'll come on the show later. I've talked with another Syriac expert. I've yet to find anyone that will say Ephraim is talking about a baptism of sin for Mary. They just don't believe that. They just don't teach that. And I think when we look at the way the fathers use terminology, like you mentioned a little while ago, Elijah, when the fathers talk about flesh of sin, as you know, Hilary of Poitiers even said Christ had a flesh of sin. A number of fathers even said that about Christ. Fulgentius said that as well. Context is very important. We need to realize what is being talked about. And when we do look at what is being talked about, we can see that really the arguments that are being levied against this teaching, I mean, in my real opinion, I really don't think they hold much weight. I will be honest with you. I find the Immaculate Conception to be probably one of my favorite things to dialogue about, debate about. There are good arguments that you can present against the teaching. I believe they can be answered logically. I believe that there are good arguments you can present. I just don't believe that these particular arguments that we're talking about are very good. And I think the reason I don't believe it is there are a number of Eastern scholars that hold to this teaching that are Eastern Orthodox. There are several of their pillars of the faith that clearly taught it. You've got it in John of Damascus. We're told that John of Damascus said that Mary avoided, I think that I pulled up the Greek, I was looking at it, that Mary avoided, she turned her mind away from all kinds of sin. It's actually how it reads in the Greek. So we're then told that must mean that because Mary did that, Mary had original sin. I mean, I just don't follow that kind of logic. I think John of Damascus is very clear when he says that she came from an all-holy sperm. By the way, John of Damascus is using language that would have been particular to his time period. He's using that to describe that Mary was definitely conceived without original sin. I mean, there's really no doubt about that. Elijah, I know you said you were looking up a few things on the flesh of sin. Were you able to dig anything up?
I was. Can you hear me there, William?
No, Elijah. Elijah might have left us, maybe.
I can hear him. Can you hear me, William?
I hear you clearly.
I could hear Elijah when he just spoke a moment ago.
Oh, wow.
William,
I couldn't hear him.
You
Okay.
can't hear me.
Okay,
I know
go
Michael
ahead.
can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you, Elijah.
Okay.
Maybe turn your microphone off and on again real quick. Let's try that.
Can you hear me now, William?
I guess he can't, but I can hear you. But
I wonder, are people watching, are they able to hear him? That would be the most important thing.
I imagine so. I could check the audio real quick here on YouTube, but
Okay.
Elijah, I say go ahead and take it.
Yeah, definitely.
I'll
You
check.
can let me know whenever he wants to toss the ball back to me.
Okay. Yeah, so I found the reference here to flesh of sin, and just to put it in context here, he talks about how, as I mentioned earlier, Mary's immunity with regards to original sin is an immunity of fact and not an immunity of right. Where Christ, it was by right because he was born of a virgin, conceived from a virgin, and there was no concupiscence there. And with Mary, it was not by right, but by fact, because God had to step in and make sure that she did not contract original sin. And this is all done by grace. And this is what Dr. Albert Kipps writes with regards to that. He says, I'm quoting, keeping in mind the distinction between immunity of fact and immunity by right, one can understand in what sense some of the fathers have written that Mary is the daughter of Adam according to the flesh, before being the daughter of God according to grace. It is an expression which must be understood of a priority of nature and not of time. In the same sense, other fathers could call Mary flesh of sin, signifying by it her submission by right to the laws of sin. And end quote. And he goes on to talk about how Mary was exempted, that her exemption was done by grace, right? It wasn't done by right. Now, and then he goes on to talk about the preternatural gifts and how each one, we got to look at each one as I said before. But moving forward on the article, he does touch upon her state of original sin, and he said, her state of original justice. He says, Mary was not placed in the state of original justice in virtue of her Immaculate Conception, nor did she possess an absolute right to the preternatural gifts, such as were conferred by original justice. From the fact, therefore, that Mary was preserved from original sin through grace, it does not follow that she was preserved also from its effects. For God does not necessarily have to connect the gifts with sanctifying grace. This is very crucial. And when we have Eastern Orthodox and Protestants and whatnot trying to show us fathers that said that Mary died or that Mary suffered, and saying that this means that they don't believe that that Mary was free from original sin, it doesn't follow at all. I'd like to discuss real quick here church fathers in general, generally speaking. To me, people like to go to the church fathers and try to find passages, and they ask us for proof. Where do the church fathers teach that Mary did not contract original sin at all in any of her existence? And the Catholic quotes fathers that say Mary had no sin or committed no sin, and then the Eastern Orthodox or Protestant will say, well, he's just talking about personal sin. He's not talking about original sin. Now, what I believe a Catholic should do, and what an Eastern Orthodox should look into, is about the teaching about, did Mary have, did the devil have dominion over her, right? So if the fathers talk about Mary not having contracted original sin in the sense that the devil did not have dominion over her, that right there to me is where the dogma of original sin and Immaculate Conception are. Like that's what we need to look into. We have Saint John Damascene, where he talks about how Mary died, but her death was different from the rest of us. It wasn't a death where she was punished for anything, but it was a death where she entered into glory. And so right there, if death is connected to the dominion of the devil over us, and that does not equate to how Mary died or why Mary died, then one could conclude that St. John Damascene is saying that she is not born the way we are born, or she was not conceived the way we are conceived. She had different gifts and privileges that we don't enjoy. And William had something in his debate about the Immaculate Conception when he debated from Ambrose, where he says, talking about how Mary did not come from the line of like a regular human being. She had her own unique line where it wasn't from Sarah, it was from Mary. He says, count me not from Sarah, but from Mary. And he shows clearly that there is a difference here between a line which is a very natural line from Sarah, and this other line where it's sort of, in a sense, a supernatural line that comes from Mary. And moving on, there's fathers that talk about how she was the flower among thorns, and there's a difference here between the two, where we are the thorns because we are born in a fallen state, and she isn't, right? And then another one where they talk about how she was a new dough and not the old leaven that we are from. And so you can see the distinction here the fathers make between how we are, our line where we're conceived, how we're born, and then you see the one from Mary's line. And to me, those are the more powerful passages that talk about the church fathers. But I do like to pass it on to William, and I don't know if you heard any of that.
I heard everything. Yeah, I probably had a little bit of an error on my end. I restarted the browser. All good. I can hear you clearly. I heard everything. Yeah, you able
Awesome.
to hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, great. Yeah. So yeah, you made a bunch of really good points there. But I would say that they're fantastic points. One thing that I did leading up to my debate against a certain individual, I looked at the usage of flesh and sin, and one thing that really stood out to me as a bit surprising was you've got individuals like Anselm, Aquinas, and Peter Damian, which talk about fathers that use the term flesh and sin. And St. Anselm, when he's talking about the tradition of the usage of this term, he actually says, don't confuse it for being mentioned, for it talking about somebody having original sin. And he says, original sin can only be in a rational nature. It's not in the flesh. Aquinas says, original sin can by no means be in the flesh as in its subject, but only in the soul. Peter Damian says, the flesh of the virgin, which was taken from Adam, did not admit the stains of Adam. I found it really incredible that we have a number, and really not just these, we have a number of individuals around that time period. Maybe people were finally saying, well, why are the fathers using this terminology about Christ, about Mary, and what have you? And it led to a number of pillars of the faith talking about, well, look, this is how the church has used it. It doesn't mean original sin. I found that to be very telling and very important. But going down, we've pretty much covered almost everything of substance. So really, I'm going down the list, and the last thing that I see, I saw Cyril of Jerusalem quoted. There really is nothing there at all. But the one thing that really did stick out to me was Leo's, well, no, not Leo's tone, but Pope Leo. Leading up to my debate with my good friend Turton. By the way, he is our Protestant, our Reformed mainstay on the show. Really good, great debating opponent, great guy. And we debated on the issue of whether or not a certain amount of popes denied the Immaculate Conception. And I remember talking to my good friend Father Coppis, who, by the way, does talk about Pope Leo in here. And looking over everything that Leo wrote in Leo's nativity sermons, where he talks about Mary being unsullied, says Christ is born from the body of his unsullied mother, which means pure. But I know people will then say, well, he's only talking about her being a virgin. It could be a fair point. The problem is, well, not the problem. The thing is, Pope Leo talks about Mary as being a pure virgin. And then after he calls her a royal and pure virgin, he also uses the language of calling her pure, unsullied. Whereas that might not be enough. The word he uses means without tarnish and without blemish. It doesn't only mean pure in the sense of virginity pure. We know that because in the Tome of Leo, as translated by my very good friend Father Coppis, by the way, he put a note. I'm going to read a note that Father Coppis made in regards to Leo. He says, Pope Leo was committed to the idea of human flesh being encumbered by the culpa, the guilt, the liability, the fault of Adam. Leo's teaching on original sin was enshrined at Chalcedon with the famous Tome of Leo, very famous. Anybody familiar with Eastern Orthodoxy, Eastern Catholicism, what have you, they should know at least a little bit about the Tome of Leo. We talk about it a lot. As Father Coppis says, when speaking of Christ's flesh that he took from Mary, and I'm going to read the translation. The devil was causing humans to lose the gifts of God and to die. He called for the realization of a secret plan whereby the unalterable God, whose will is indistinguishable from his goodness, might bring the original realization of his kindness towards us to completion by means of a more hidden mystery, and whereby humanity, which had been led into guilt, it's talking about original sin, in culpum, by the craftiness of the devil, might not perish contrary to the purpose of God. And born by a new mode of birth, talking about Mary here. That is talking about Christ, but then he talks about Mary. Because inviolate virginity, while ignorant of concupiscence, supplied the matter of his flesh. Then we read a little bit forward. Christ was born of a virgin's womb. Nature was taken from the mother of the Lord, not guilt. And the fact that the birth was miraculous does not imply that in the Lord Jesus Christ, born from the virgin's womb, the nature is different from our own. That is from the Tome of Leo. So, in my opinion, and really, I'm not the only one that would make this what I wouldn't even call a bold claim. A number of people can clearly see Pope Leo did not believe Mary had original sin. The language, when you go to the language that remains to us, when you go to the text, it is very clear. As my friend Father Kappa says, it is quite powerful that I argue, and many other scholars argue, that Pope Leo did not believe Mary had any original sin. And by the way, the nativity hymns from Pope Leo, those are not infallible decrees, but that is a whole other argument for a whole other day. But regardless of that, Pope Leo's tome, I think, makes it very clear that he viewed Mary as an exception. I think we've gone over a whole lot. For people that may be thinking, you guys, I wanted you guys to go 100 hours or 200 hours. We will talk about this even more in depth. By the way, I don't want to tease you guys, and you guys say, you know what, William, you're a jerk. There's specifically certain things we didn't talk about that we will definitely cover when we have Father Coppins on, who really, that is going to be an incredible show. I mean, Michael, you know that's going to be a great show.
Yeah,
we're going to cover, by then we will have a little bit of stuff that we've dug up on Romano Similidis, which we think is very, very powerful. For people that are really, really insistent that, despite the fact that we argue, and by the way, Father Coppins is very clear, he does believe this is a historical teaching. I am saying that because he's told me I can say it. He does believe it is apostolic. He does. And he's looked at every usage of pro-Catholicism, and we'll look at them again in a week if people want. But for people that are really, really sticklers for certain details and say, I want fathers that talked about the actual conception, you have Romanos, you have John of Damascus, you have Paschasius Robertus, you have individuals that wrote about it at a very early period. But I would recommend people also read the Bull Ineffabilis Deus, which is very clear. The teaching is about Mary's nature. That was gifted to her by our Almighty God, by the merits of Christ. Nothing that she could have done. And that is what is most important. Elijah, I think Elijah was great. Elijah, thank you for your help here. I think you're incredible.
Great talk, William. You did a great job. That was amazing.
Well done, y'all. And you know, as you were noting, this is basically a pregame show, a warm up for the Father Coppins video. So he'll be on next week, as you mentioned, and we'll talk more about the Immaculate Conception then. But I do want to mention there is an article on eclectic orthodoxy. It's by Father Lev Gillette, I guess is how you pronounce his name. Might be Gillette, but I'll go with Gillette for now. It's called The Immaculate Conception in the Orthodox Church. And what he does is, in this article, he goes through quite a few Eastern Orthodox theologians and shows that they held to the Immaculate Conception. He also notes several Eastern Orthodox saints who explicitly affirmed the Immaculate Conception. And then he notes that it is a theologumenon. So this is not something that is dogmatic in Eastern Orthodoxy, but it's also not heresy. It's in that middle position that is basically a theological opinion. Whereas, of course, in Catholicism, it's a dogma. But for the East, you can't call it heresy, can't call it dogma, and has this other middle position. So it's very well worth noting and reading. Again, it's on Eclectic Orthodoxy. I want to say it's wordpress.com or something like that. But if you just type that in, you'll find it. And in fact, I'll put a link at the description. But I don't see any questions in the chat, so we'll go ahead and kill the stream here, and we'll pick it up again next week with Father Kappas. Gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on. Excellent job there, William. Thank you so much for the time also that you put into this. So thank you.
God bless you guys.
Thank you, Elijah.
Thank you, Elijah, also for coming on and for your work. Everyone, please comment, like, subscribe, share this material on your social media. Till next time, God bless you all.